The Vasco da Gama, first Count of Vidigueira, was a Portuguese explorer and the first European to reach India by sea. His initial voyage to India was the first to link Europe and Asia by an ocean route, connecting the Atlantic and the Indian Oceans, and, in this way, the West and the Orient. Da Gama's discovery of the sea route to India was significant and opened the way for an age of global imperialism and for the Portuguese to establish a long-lasting colonial empire in Asia. Traveling the ocean route allowed the Portuguese to avoid sailing across the highly disputed Mediterranean and traversing the dangerous Arabian Peninsula. The sum of the distances covered in the outward and return voyages made this expedition the longest ocean voyage ever made until then, far longer than a full voyage around the world by way of the equator. After decades of sailors trying to reach the Indies, with thousands of lives and dozens of vessels lost in shipwrecks and attacks, Da Gama landed in Calicut on the 20th of May 1498. Unopposed access to the Indian spice routes boosted the economy of the Portuguese Empire, which was previously based along northern and coastal West Africa. The spices obtained from Southeast Asia were primarily pepper and cinnamon at first, but soon included other products, all new to Europe. Portugal maintained a commercial monopoly of these commodities for several decades. It would be a century later before other European powers such as the Netherlands and England, followed by France and Denmark, were able to challenge Portugal's monopoly and naval supremacy in the Cape route. Da Gama led two of the Portuguese armadas destined for India, the first and the fourth. The latter was the largest and departed for India 4 years after his return from the first one. For his contributions, Da Gama was appointed the governor of India in 1524, under the title of Viceroy, and given the newly created county of Vidigueira in 1519. The Vasco da Gama remains a leading figure in the history of exploration. Numerous homages have been made worldwide to celebrate his explorations and accomplishments. The Portuguese national epic, Os Lusíadas, was written in his honor. His first trip to India is widely considered a milestone in world history, as it marked the beginning of a sea-based phase of global multiculturalism. In March 2016, researchers announced that thousands of artifacts and vessel remains had been recovered from the ship Esmeralda, one of Da Gama's armada, found off the coast of Oman. Early life. The Vasco da Gama was born in 1460 or 1469 in Sines, on the southwest coast of Portugal, probably in a house near the church of Nossa Senhora das Salas. Sines, one of the few seaports on the Alentejo coast, consisted of little more than a cluster of whitewashed, red-tiled cottages, occupied chiefly by fisherfolk. The Vasco da Gama's father was Da Gama, who had served in the 1460s as a knight of the household of Infante Ferdinand, Duke of Viseu. He rose in the ranks of the military order of Santiago. Da Gama was appointed alcaide-mor of Sines in the 1460s, a post he held until 1478. After that he continued as a receiver of taxes and holder of the order's commenders in the region. Da Gama married Isabel Sodré, a daughter of João Sodré, scion of a well-connected family of English origin. Her father and her brothers, Vicente Sodré and Braz Sodré, had links to the household of Infante Diogo, Duke of Viseu, and were prominent figures in the military order of Christ. The Vasco da Gama was the third of 5 sons of Da Gama and Isabel Sodré in order of age: Paulo da Gama, João Sodré, Vasco da Gama, Pedro da Gama and Iris da Gama. The Vasco also had one known sister, Teresa.Da Gama. Little is known of Da Gama's early life. The Portuguese historian Teixeira de Aragão suggests that he studied at the inland town of Évora, which is where he may have learned mathematics and navigation. It has been claimed that he studied under the astrologer and astronomer Abraham Zacuto, but Da Gama's biographer Subramaniam thinks this dubious. Around 1480, Da Gama followed his father and joined the Order of Santiago. The Master of Santiago was Prince John, who ascended to the throne in 1481 as King John II of Portugal. John II doted on the order, and the Da Gama's prospects rose accordingly. In 1492, John II dispatched Da Gama on a mission to the port of Setúbal and to the Algarve to seize French ships in retaliation for peacetime depredations against Portuguese shipping, a task that Da Gama rapidly and effectively performed. Exploration before Da Gama. From the earlier part of the 15th century, Portuguese expeditions organized by Prince Henry the Navigator had been reaching down the African coastline, principally in search of West African riches. They had greatly extended Portuguese maritime knowledge, but had little profit to show for the effort. After Henry's death in 1460, the Portuguese crown showed little interest in continuing this effort and, in 1469, sold off the neglected African enterprise to a private Lisbon merchant consortium led by Fernão Gomes. Within a few years, Gomes' captains expanded Portuguese knowledge across the Gulf of Guinea, doing business in gold dust, Melgeta pepper, ivory and sub-Saharan slaves. When Gomes' charter came up for renewal in 1474, Prince John asked his father Afonso V of Portugal to pass the African charter to him. Upon becoming king in 1481, John II of Portugal set out on many long reforms to break the monarch's dependence on the feudal nobility. John II needed to build up the royal treasury. He considered royal commerce to be the key to achieving that. Under John II's watch, the golden slave trade in West Africa was greatly expanded. He was eager to break into the highly profitable spice trade between Europe and Asia, which was conducted chiefly by land. At the time, this was virtually monopolized by the Republic of Venice, who operated overland routes via Levantine and Egyptian ports, through the Red Sea across to the spice markets of India. John II set a new objective for his captains, to find a sea route to Asia by sailing around the African continent. By the time Vasco da Gama was in his 20s, the king's plans were coming to fruition. In 1487, John II dispatched two spies, Pero da Covila and Afonso de Paiva, overland via Egypt to East Africa and India, to scout the details of the spice markets and trade routes. The breakthrough came soon after, when John II's captain Bartolomeu Diaz returned from rounding the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, having explored as far as the Fish River in modern-day South Africa and having verified that the unknown coast stretched away to the northeast. An explorer was needed who could prove the link between the findings of Diaz and those of da Covila and de Paiva, and connect these separate segments into a potentially lucrative trade route across the Indian Ocean. First voyage. On the 8th of July 1497, Vasco da Gama led a fleet of 4 ships with a crew of 170 men from Lisbon. The distance traveled in the journey around Africa to India and back was greater than around the equator. The navigators included Portugal's most experienced Pero de Alenque, Pedro Escobar, João de Coimbra and Afonso Goncalves. It is not known for certain how many people were in each ship's crew, but approximately 55 returned, and 2 ships were lost. 2 of the vessels were Zena US and newly built for the voyage, possibly a caravel and a supply boat. The 4 ships were: São Gabriel, commanded by Vasco da Gama, a carrack of 178 tons, length 27 meters, width 8.5 meters, draft 2.3 meters, sails of 372 square meters. São Rafael, commanded by his brother Paulo da Gama, similar dimensions to the São Gabriel. The Caravel Berrio, slightly smaller than the former 2, commanded by Nicolau Coelho, a storage ship of unknown name, commanded by Goncalo Nunes, later lost near the Bay of São Brás, along the east coast of Africa. Journey to the Cape. The expedition set sail from Lisbon on 8 July 1497. It followed the route pioneered by earlier explorers along the coast of Africa via Tenerife and the Cape Verde Islands. After reaching the coast of present-day Sierra Leone, Da Gama took a course south into the open ocean, crossing the equator and seeking the South Atlantic westerlies that Bartolomeu Diaz had discovered in 1487. This course proved successful, and on 4 November 1497, the expedition made landfall on the African coast. For over 3 months the ships had sailed more than 10,000 kilometers of open ocean, by far the longest journey out of sight of land made by that time. By the 16th of December, the fleet had passed the Great Fish River, where Diaz had turned back, and sailed into waters previously unknown to Europeans. With Christmas pending, Da Gama and his crew gave the coast they were passing the name Natal, which carried the connotation of birth of Christ in Portuguese. Mozambique. Vasco da Gama spent 2 to the 29th of March 1498 in the vicinity of Mozambique Island. Arab-controlled territory on the East African coast was an integral part of the network of trade in the Indian Ocean. Fearing the local population would be hostile to Christians, Da Gama impersonated a Muslim and gained audience with the Sultan of Mozambique. With the paltry trade goods he had to offer, the explorer was unable to provide a suitable gift to the ruler. Soon the local populace became suspicious of Da Gama and his men. Forced by a hostile crowd to flee Mozambique, Da Gama departed the harbor, firing his cannons into the city in retaliation. Mombasa, in the vicinity of modern Kenya, the expedition resorted to piracy, looting Arab merchant ships that were generally unarmed trading vessels without heavy cannons. The Portuguese became the first known Europeans to visit the port of Mombasa from 7 to the 13th of April 1498, but were met with hostility and soon departed. Malindi. Vasco da Gama continued north, arriving on the 14th of April 1498 at the friendlier port of Malindi, whose leaders were having a conflict with those of Mombasa. There the expedition first noted evidence of Indian traders. Da Gama and his crew contracted the services of a pilot who used his knowledge of the monsoon winds to guide the expedition the rest of the way to Calicut, located on the southwest coast of India. Sources differ over the identity of the pilot, calling him variously a Christian, a Muslim, and a Gujarati. One traditional story describes the pilot as the famous Arab navigator Ibn Majid, but other contemporaneous accounts place Majid elsewhere, and he could not have been near the vicinity at the time. None of the Portuguese historians of the time mentions Ibn Majid. The Vasco da Gama left Malindi for India on the 24th of April 1498. Calicut, India. The fleet arrived in Kapadu near Calicut, India on the 20th of May 1498. The king of Calicut, the Samudiri, who was at the time staying in his second capital at Ponani, returned to Calicut on hearing the news of the foreign fleet's arrival. The navigator was received with traditional hospitality, including a grand procession of at least 3,000 armed nairs. But an interview with the Zamorin failed to produce any concrete results. The presents that Da Gama sent to the Zamorin as gifts from Dom Manuel, 4 cloaks of scarlet cloth, 6 hats, 4 branches of corals, 12 almaces, a box with 7 brass vessels, a chest of sugar, 2 barrels of oil and a cask of honey, were trivial, and failed to impress. While Zamorin's officials wondered at why there was no gold or silver, the Muslim merchants who considered.Da Gama the rival suggested that the latter was only an ordinary pirate and not a royal ambassador. The Vasco da Gama's request for permission to leave a factor behind him in charge of the merchandise he could not sell was turned down by the king, who insisted that.Da Gama pay customs duty, preferably in gold, like any other trader, which strained the relation between the two. Annoyed by this.Da Gama carried a few nares and 16 fishermen off with him by force. Nevertheless.Da Gama's expedition was successful beyond all reasonable expectation, bringing in cargo that was worth 60 times the cost of the expedition. Return. The Vasco da Gama left Calicut on the 29th of August 1498. Eager to set sail for home, he ignored the local knowledge of monsoon wind patterns that were still blowing on shore. The fleet initially inched north along the Indian coast, and then anchored in at Angediva Island for a spell. They finally struck out for their Indian Ocean crossing on the 3rd of October 1498. But with the winter monsoon yet to set in, it was a harrowing journey. On the outgoing journey, sailing with the summer monsoon wind.Da Gama's fleet crossed the Indian Ocean in only 23 days. Now, on the return trip, sailing against the wind, it took 132 days.Da Gama saw land again only on the 2nd of January 1499, passing before the coastal Somali city of Mogadishu. Then, under the influence of the Ajuran Empire in the Horn of Africa, the fleet did not make a stop but passing before Mogadishu. The anonymous diarist of the expedition noted that it was a large city with houses of 4 or 5 stories high and big palaces in its center and many mosques with cylindrical minarets.Da Gama's fleet finally arrived in Malindi on the 7th of January 1499, in a terrible state. Approximately half of the crew had died during the crossing, and many of the rest were afflicted with scurvy. Not having enough crewmen left standing to manage 3 ships.Da Gama ordered the São Rafael scuttled off the East African coast, and the crew redistributed to the remaining 2 ships, the São Gabriel and the Barrio. Thereafter the sailing was smoother. By early March they had arrived in Mossel Bay, and crossed the Cape of Good Hope in the opposite direction on the 20th of March, reaching the West African coast by the 25th of April. The diary record of the expedition ends abruptly here. Reconstructing from other sources, it seems they continued to Cape Verde, where Nicolau Coelho's Barrio separated from Vasco da Gama's São Gabriel and sailed on by itself. The Barrio arrived in Lisbon on the 10th of July 1499, and Nicolau Coelho personally delivered the news to King Manuel I and the royal court, then assembled in Sintra. In the meantime, back in Cape Verde.Da Gama's brother, Paulo.Da Gama, had fallen grievously ill.Da Gama elected to stay by his side on Santiago Island and handed the São Gabriel over to his clerk, João de Sá, to take home. The São Gabriel under Sá arrived in Lisbon sometime in late July or early August.Da Gama and his sickly brother eventually hitched a ride with a Guinea caravel returning to Portugal, but Paulo.Da Gama died en route.Da Gama got off at the Azores to bury his brother at the monastery of São Francisco in Angra de Heroísmo, and he lingered there for a little while in mourning. He eventually took passage on an Azorian Iberian caravel and finally arrived in Lisbon on 29 August 1499, or early September. Despite his melancholic mood, Da Gama was given a hero's welcome and showered with honors, including a triumphal procession and public festivities. King Manuel wrote 2 letters in which he described Da Gama's first voyage, in July and August 1499. Soon after the return of the ships, Girolamo Zernighi also wrote 3 letters describing Da Gama's first voyage soon after the return of the expedition. The expedition had exacted a large cost. 1 ship and over half the men had been lost. It had also failed in its principal mission of securing a commercial treaty with Calicut. Nonetheless, the spices brought back on the remaining 2 ships were sold at an enormous profit to the crown. The Vasco da Gama was justly celebrated for opening a direct sea route to Asia. His path would be followed up thereafter by yearly Portuguese India armadas. The spice trade would prove to be a major asset to the Portuguese royal treasury, and other consequences soon followed. For example, Da Gama's voyage had made it clear that the east coast of Africa, the Contra Costa, was essential to Portuguese interests. Its ports provided fresh water, provisions, timber, and harbors for repairs, and served as a refuge where ships could wait out unfavorable weather. One significant result was the colonization of Mozambique by the Portuguese crown. Rewards. In December 1499, King Manuel I of Portugal rewarded Vasco da Gama with the town of Sines as a hereditary fief. This turned out to be a complicated affair, for Sines still belonged to the Order of Santiago. The master of the order, George de Lancaster, might have endorsed the reward. After all, Da Gama was a Santiago knight, one of their own, and a close associate of Lancaster himself. But the fact that Sines was awarded by the king provoked Lancaster to refuse out of principle, lest it encourage the king to make other donations of the order's properties. Da Gama would spend the next few years attempting to take hold of Sines, an effort that would estrange him from Lancaster and eventually prompt Da Gama to abandon his beloved Order of Santiago, switching over to the rival Order of Christ in 1507. In the meantime, Da Gama made with a substantial hereditary royal pension of 300,000 reis. He was awarded the noble title of Dom in perpetuity for himself, his siblings and the descendants. On the 30th of January 1502, Da Gama was awarded the title of Almirante dos Mares de Arabia, Persia, India Reda todo o Oriente, an overwrought title reminiscent of the ornate Castilian title borne by Christopher Columbus. Another royal letter, dated October 1501, gave Da Gama the personal right to intervene and exercise a determining role on any future India-bound fleet. Around 1501, Vasco da Gama married Catarina de Ataide, daughter of Alvaro de Ataide, the Alcaide Moor of Alvor, and a prominent nobleman connected by kinship with the powerful Almeida family. Second voyage. The follow-up expedition, the Second India Armada, launched in 1500 under the command of Pedro Alvarez Cabral with the mission of making a treaty with the Zamorin of Calicut and setting up a Portuguese factory in the city. However, Pedro Cabral entered into a conflict with the local Arab merchant guilds, with the result that the Portuguese factory was overrun in a riot and up to 70 Portuguese were killed. Cabral blamed the Zamorin for the incident and bombarded the city. Thus war broke out between Portugal and Calicut. The Vasco da Gama invoked his royal letter to take command of the Fourth India Armada, scheduled to set out in 1502, with the explicit aim of taking revenge upon the Zamorin and force him to submit to Portuguese terms. The heavily armed fleet of 15 ships and 800 men left Lisbon on the 12th of February 1502. It was followed in April by another squadron of 5 ships led by his cousin, Orient.Da Gama, which caught up to them in the Indian Ocean. The Fourth Armada was a veritable Da Gama family affair. 2 of his maternal uncles, Vicente Sodre and Bras Sodre, were pre-designated to command an Indian Ocean naval patrol, while brothers-in-law Alvaro de Ratide and Lopo Mendes de Vasconcelos captained ships in the main fleet. On the outgoing voyage, Da Gama's fleet opened contact with the East African gold trading port of Sofala and reduced the Sultanate of Kilwa to tribute, extracting a substantial sum of gold. On reaching India in October 1502, Da Gama's fleet set about capturing any Arab vessel he came across in Indian waters, most notoriously the Miri, a pilgrim ship from Mecca, whose passengers he massacred in open water. He then appeared before Calicut, demanding redress for the treatment of Cabral, while the Zamorin was willing to sign a new treaty. Da Gama made a call to the Hindu king to expel all Muslims from Calicut before beginning negotiations, which was turned down. The Portuguese fleet then bombarded the city for nearly 2 days from the seashore, severely damaging the unfortified city. He also captured several rice vessels and cut off the crews' hands, ears and noses, dispatching them with an insulting note to the Zamorin. The violent treatment meted out by Da Gama quickly brought trade along the Malabar coast of India, upon which Calicut depended, to a standstill, but the Zamorin nonetheless refused to submit to Portuguese terms, and even ventured to hire a fleet of strong warships to challenge Da Gama's armada. Da Gama loaded up with spices at Kochi and Cannanore, small nearby kingdoms, half vassal and half at war with the Zamorin, whose alliances had been secured by prior Portuguese fleets. The Fourth Armada left India in early 1503. Da Gama left behind a small squadron of caravels under the command of his uncle, Vicente Sodre, to patrol the Indian coast, to continue harassing Calicut shipping, and to protect the Portuguese factories at Kochi and Cannanore from the Zamorin's inevitable reprisals. The Vasco da Gama arrived back in Portugal in September 1503, effectively having failed in his mission to bring the Zamorin to submission. This failure, and the subsequent more galling failure of his uncle Vicente Sodre to protect the Portuguese factory in Kochi, probably counted against any further rewards. When the Portuguese king Manuel I of Portugal decided to appoint the first governor and viceroy of Portuguese India in 1505, Da Gama was conspicuously overlooked, and the post given to Francisco de Almeida. Pilgrim ship incident. On his second voyage, Vasco da Gama inflicted acts of cruelty upon competing traders and local inhabitants, which sealed his notoriety in India. During his second voyage to Calicut, Da Gama intercepted a ship of Muslim pilgrims at Asia.Traveling from Calicut to Mecca, described in detail by eyewitness Tomé Lopes and chronicler Gaspar Correa. Da Gama looted the ship with over 400 pilgrims on board, including 50 women, locked in the passengers, the owner and an ambassador from Egypt, and burned them to death. They offered the wealth, which could ransom all the Christian slaves in the kingdom of Fez and much more, but were not spared. Da Gama looked on through the porthole and saw the women bringing up the gold and jewels and holding up the babies to beg for mercy. After demanding the expulsion of Muslims from Calicut to the Hindu Zamorin, the latter sent the high priest Talapana Namboothiri for talks. Da Gama called him a spy, or ordered the priest's lips and ears to be cut off, and after sewing a pair of dog's ears to his head, sent him away. Interlude. For the next 2 decades, Vasco da Gama lived out a quiet life, unwelcome in the royal court and sidelined from Indian affairs. His attempts to return to the favor of Manuel I yielded little. Almeida, the larger-than-life Afonso de Albuquerque and, later on, Albergaria and Seguera, were the king's preferred point men for India. After Ferdinand Magellan defected to the crown of Castile in 1518, Vasco da Gama threatened to do the same, prompting the king to undertake steps to retain him in Portugal and avoid the embarrassment of losing his own Admiral of the Indies to Spain. In 1519, after years of ignoring his petitions, King Manuel I finally hurried to give Vasco da Gama a feudal title, appointing him the first Count of Vidigueira, a count title created by a royal decree issued in Evora on 29 December, after a complicated agreement with Dom Jaime, Duke of Braganza, who ceded him on payment the towns of Vidigueira and Vila dos Frades. The decree granted Vasco da Gama and his heirs all the revenues and privileges related, thus establishing da Gama as the first Portuguese count who was not born with royal blood.